save our Mother Earth from any alien attack.
From vicious giant insects who have once again come back.
We'll unleash all our forces, we will cut them any slack. Absolutely right.
The EDF deploys.
Earth Defense Force 2025 is the fourth game in the series, the direct sequel to EDF 2017. Sorry, Insect Armageddon, you don't count. 1 year after it released in the West, 2025 was remastered for the next-gen consoles with the title Earth Defense Force 4.1 Shadow of New Despair. This is the version most people play, since it's on Steam, has more content, and is overall the better game. In addition to making the game look nicer and run smoother, there's a whole host of minor changes, such as adding in more NPCs and tanks to make it feel like there's a real war going on, making the tunnels pitch black besides your gunfire and flashlights, and just a crap ton of buffs and nerfs. 2 new vehicles were added, Depth Crawler and Walking Fortress Balam. Without the Depth Crawler, tunnel missions must have been torture for A raiders, since they literally can't use any other vehicles down there. The Walking Fortress Balam was included to combat the newly added Urginus enemy type, and the Rock'em Sock'em Megazord fight sequences are such a fun spectacle they basically market the game themselves. Certain enemies drop items where they didn't previously, others drop far more than before, their AI has been improved in some cases, the variety of weapons NPCs carry has been increased, and a few enemies that only showed up in DLC missions are added to the higher difficulties in a few regular missions. That's about as much as I'm willing to cover on the differences between the two. From here on out, we'll be focusing on 4.1 exclusively. Something that becomes apparent the more you play the Earth Defense Force series is that the games are, without question, very similar. There's not much that gets drastically changed from game to game, but over time, improvements and small additions get stacked on top of each other, basically resulting in a better iteration of EDF with every entry. Each new release boasts more weapons, missions, and enemy types. The visuals get slightly prettier, a few mechanics get introduced or are further refined, and the game overall gets a little more optimized. As much as I love and appreciate EDF 2017, I'm not sure if I could recommend someone go back and play that game before 4.1. Likewise, if you only have room for one EDF game in your life right now, I wouldn't suggest you play 4.1 over 5. I don't think this is a bad thing, it just means that the newest mainline game is essentially the best one to play when it releases, and a series getting better over time is exactly what you want. That said though, there are quite a few distinct qualities specific to each game which makes them worth a revisit once you get more invested in the franchise. 4.1 and 5 have 4 unique classes which 2017 didn't, but 2017 and 4.1 have Hectors, which 5 doesn't. 5 does have a very worthwhile replacement, but the point remains, the big goofy looking flaily robots are locked behind playing an older version of EDF, and splattering them with 4 different classes or online with friends is locked behind a single entry, 4.1. The homing missiles are an even better example. In 4.1, the homing weapons now have a maximum range to them and require a lock-on. The time it takes to lock on even varies from weapon to weapon. This has been carried into 5 as well, and although it is an improvement, since the early levels are more balanced and there can be greater variety with homing weapons as a result of the additional stats, 2017 now has something going for it that the others don't. If you want to stand at the very edge of the map and spam missiles directly into the sky, you can do that here. There are a few other unique characteristics that belong to 2017, and 4.1 has a couple when comparing it to 5. Each game having reasons to come back to them, and the series continually improving itself, is the best of both worlds. The gameplay of shooting bugs and robots is completely intact, and is as satisfying as it was in 2017. The ants, spiders, and even a few new bugs spray their colored liquid when shot and killed. The Hectors still visibly react to being hit and have a catastrophic-looking defeat, which is somehow still enjoyable to trigger even after so much time with the game. Same for the way all the giant spaceships explode when you've dealt the final blow. You still have the ability to bulldoze the entire city in your pursuit to save humanity, you still collect armor one by one to increase your total health, and grab weapon pickups to hopefully acquire something new. The ridiculous quantity of weapons to pick from is here as well, but if 2017 was ridiculous, 4.1 is comically insane. 171 weapons in 2017, whereas here there are 801, and that doesn't even account for the DLC weapons. Not that I would, since they're a big scam, but that's besides the point. There being 4 different classes goes some way in explaining that big number, but even dividing it by 4, 200 is still very high. Not to dog on Insect Armageddon, since I did a thorough job of it in the last EDF video, but there being this many makes a bit of sense when you consider that every class in this game has drastically different weapons. In Insect Armageddon, it felt like they were all interchangeable, like the weapons themselves could be tossed between soldiers and you'd barely notice. Well, that's not the case here. The Ranger has the most basic weaponry, standard guns and equipment you might think of in other games. Rifles, shotguns, grenades, missiles, rockets, and some other miscellaneous stuff, such as some healing tools, flamethrowers, bound guns, and so on. A few guns boast a high damage output but can't reload at all, much like in 2017. The burner even made a comeback. The Air Raider has a lot of utility equipment, things that can make other teammates better. Think buffs, health regens, and shields. They have control over the sky, touting a ton of ways to call down heavenly firepower. Airstrikes, bombing runs, and other crazy satellite weapons. They can even coordinate with other classes with their laser-guided kits, allowing squad mates to use certain weapons they couldn't otherwise. They have some shitty impulse mine things, decent turrets, literal explosive Roombas and beetles, and some kind of wacky but fairly consistent guns that are basically the only way they directly deal damage without the use of credits. More on that later. Lastly, they get all the vehicles. You throw down a flare and wait for the helicopter to bring the goods. These can range from a simple bike to tanks, helicopters, oversized missile launchers on wheels, and even giant mechs. The Fencer is almost a mech all by itself. His base speed is extremely slow, but he has two sets of dual loadouts, and the ways in which each weapon can complement the other is fairly nuanced. He gets shields, oversized swords, hammers, and axes, giant spears and harpoons, artillery cannons, and a ton of other huge pieces of equipment. Certain weapons grant the ability to dash, and others the ability to jump. Once you learn how to dash cancel, the Fencer can actually become the quickest unit in the game. I doubt this was an intentional feature, since it doesn't come back in EDF Vibe, but hey, maybe add that to the list of things 4.1 has going for it over 5. The Wing Diver can fly, and her ammo is tied to her jet fuel, which is something I'll talk about in detail later. Her weaponry was made from the Alien Ravager technology, much like the Fencer's shields, and thus most of her offense consists of lasers. Most of her best guns are very close range, which can shred a grouping of bugs without trouble, and when paired with smart uses of her jetpack, she really starts to turn into something great. She's basically a glass cannon build. Her health is much lower than the rest, but her damage output is incredible when used correctly. Well, I suppose that can be said for all the classes, really. During my 300 plus hours of play, there were many times where I finally had to admit to myself that, no, actually this class is the best one. It kept switching when I would see how good some equipment could be in the correct circumstances, and eventually, after many rotations of reassigning the overpowered label in my head, I conceded that, okay, all of them are great. The Air Raider's airstrikes can clear out a swarm of enemies and help considerably with more difficult foes as they approach from long range. Their vehicles can absolutely clean house, and the multi-seat bigger boys are especially a force to be reckoned with. A Fencer can rip through a sea of flying drones with his dual blades, and his hammers could be the answer to taking out troublesome Hectors with only a few hits. Their long-range artillery can blast faraway dropships out of the sky, and their top speed with the dash cancel is great for collecting items and staying alive during hectic battles. Wing divers can clear out narrow tunnels lickety-split, completely decimate any hordes of bugs that come too close, and melt enemies down to the floorboards one at a time with their high-damage close-range weaponry. Their flight allows them to collect items faster too, but it's also useful in combat, whether it's soaring directly towards and sometimes in dropships to get rid of them quickly, or deploying hit-and-run tactics against enemy spawners, flying in, demolishing the tunnel exit with a single clip, then flying away before the bugs can even do anything about it. The Ranger is the least fancy, but also most consistent unit of the bunch. They don't have anything significantly flashy, but they aren't beholden to a tank of energy to determine their reloads. They don't need to worry about their positioning or speeding up and slowing down abruptly thanks to a mech suit, and they don't need to rely on indirect ways of dealing damage or a vehicle. No, their best quality is their reliability, sniping enemies and ships from far away, maintaining the pressure on Hectors or swarms of bugs, and tending to their allies with their decently sized health pool and healing sprays. Their reload animations aren't considerably lengthy when compared to the others. They're better able to move exactly where they want thanks to their straightforward movement and roll dodge, and they have many standard guns that could be helpful in almost every situation. There's a reason the game recommends them to new players. There's far less to learn, and even when you have a seemingly bad loadout, you'll still likely be of some help to your team. There are so many different scenarios in which the varied classes show their worth, and the revolving door nature of the mission pacing almost assures that each unit's time to shine will come back around without too long of a wait. On some levels, you might not be the star of the show, and might not even feel like you're helping your team much. But then, in the next outing, your strengths get put on full display, as you'll deal with a troublesome faraway enemy, or handle an enemy spawner that others were having a hard time with. There are a few difficulties to pick from, which I'll touch on in more detail later, but when online, there's also damage and health modifiers for the enemies depending on how many people are present. I haven't done extensive testing, mind you, but essentially, enemies are more of a threat the more players are in a lobby. I actually quite like this, and it might seem like this isn't the case if you haven't played Earth Defense Force before, but these games can genuinely require a lot of strategy and skill. At a glance, you might get the impression that you just mindlessly shoot bugs without any semblance of forethought, but once you start turning up the difficulty, or reach the later missions, your weapon loadout and tactical decisions in battle become exponentially more important. There are a few levels in particular that are so rough and unforgiving that you might hit a brick wall, having to retry again and again, when you were previously cruising on by without problems. On higher difficulties, every level could be a brick wall, but especially when just starting out with not much in the way of weaponry and armor, those standout stages will be the ones where you'll finally have to think, wait, which enemy is the priority here? Is there cover I can seek out? Is there a weapon I've been neglecting that would be the silver bullet in this instance? That discovery phase is surprisingly enjoyable, and it's just not something I think these games look like they have when viewing trailers or screenshots. The later mission specifically gets so ridiculous that even on normal, aggroing the wrong enemy too soon can spell disaster. There's a handful of levels that are only available when in online lobbies. They don't show up for local play, which is actually pretty devious. As much as more teammates can be beneficial, insofar that you have more guns to blast the enemy with, the increased health and damage of the insects means one person can't handle as much on their own, and anyone not coordinating with the group could ruin it for everyone else. Demon Army in particular requires a lot more planning than usual, otherwise everything starts attacking at once, and everyone is screwed. This was the only time that a mission on normal difficulty required me and my random partner to type back and forth on how and when to proceed. You know that sigh of relief that's followed after a stressful combat encounter, where you're so intensely focused on your goal of not dying that once you finally achieve victory, a wave of catharsis washes over you? There are so many moments like that in these games. Staying alive at low health, overcoming the odds and winning it for your team, taking down a critical dropship and turning the tide of battle. This game is a ton of fun, mindless if you want it to be, but it also allows for gameplay that both engages and challenges at the same time. Playing solo can be a bit more of an uphill battle than with others, but that's not to say it isn't possible. I soloed the game on normal with both the Ranger and the Wing Diver, and I didn't even need to grind certain levels to get more armor and better weapons. If all you want is a fun time blasting bugs on your own, solo is a fine way to play the game. However, simply playing through on normal isn't where these games shine the brightest. Whether alone, with randos online, or with a friend or two, the best part of EDF is slowly advancing the difficulty when you think you're ready. These difficulties don't represent the level of challenge you want your current play session to be, they feed into each other. A truly 100% Earth Defense Force playthrough starts at easy or normal, and keeps going until Inferno is finished. I didn't quite get that far, but even going through all of Hard, and a few dozen missions on Hardest and Inferno as specific classes, the appeal of earning the right to even test the waters on those extreme difficulties is seriously rewarding. When just starting out, you literally won't be able to kill anything on Hardest or Inferno, let alone finish the mission. You need to acquire stronger weapons and armor to have a chance at those later modes, and even then, since enemy damage seems to scale exponentially instead of linearly, you might get killed after only taking a few hits. I've seen a lot of low-armored players trying out Hard and Hardest, and they basically get massacred if they make even a small mistake. Mind you, unlocking powerful weapons by skating by on a couple higher difficulty missions might give you the offense you need, but the armor pickups aren't treated the same way as the weapons are. The weapons are a binary yes or no in this game. Either you got a new gun or you didn't, a luck of the draw if you're in the right range for the gear you want. The armor is the opposite. There's no luck at all, it's a guaranteed benefit with each pickup, but it's a very, very slow process. The ratio is different for each class, with the Wing Diver receiving the least amount of hit points per pickup, and the Fencer getting the most. Armor really is the great equalizer. Unless you exploit the game in some way, there's no skipping to the front of the line. Even if you grind on easy, the time and effort still needs to be expended. You'll have to collect those red pickups one by one each and every mission you play, eventually totaling a respectable number which will hopefully be enough to avoid being one-shotted on Hardest or Inferno. I already loved EDF before making this video, but when I forced myself to really dive in for a considerable amount of time, yeah, I see it. It takes a long time, and in other games I'd outright disregard this level of grind, but slowly increasing my armor and percent completion number was fun. I think what makes this different from a few other games with grinding is twofold. First off, I'm always making progress in some way. Getting medals for completing missions with each class on each difficulty adds to your total completion percentage, which is a fun number to see go higher, but more importantly, I know I'm always growing my potential maximum health. Secondly, this game isn't player versus player. A game like Battlefront, yeah, constant improvements in my mind are incredibly irritating, since it gives the players who are already better due to playing longer, stronger stuff. Since those games are competitive PvP, I'd rather have everyone be on a level playing field, and any balance issues that prop up only serve to frustrate. In EDF, everyone has the same goal. We want to blast them bugs and robots to finish the mission. Everyone wants new weapons, everyone wants more armor, and collecting them yourself means collecting it for everyone. There's a real sense of camaraderie when you have a great group of players in EDF that just feels so wholesome. Everyone helps in their own way, but even if you have a straggler who, in a different game, could cost the team tremendously, it's no big deal, we're all here to help. Get back on your feet, soldier, let's keep blasting. Earth Defense Force has such a mood, a vibe going for it that's hard not to appreciate. It's kinda goofy and not something to be taken too seriously, but also action-packed and surprisingly easy to get invested in. It's the perfect level of camp when it comes to the story, the enemies, and the dialogue from NPCs, but it's somehow more than that. Because the consequences of this alien invasion are so transparent, and the ramifications of their onslaught bare for everyone to see, there's no discussions to be had or morals to cloud the story. This isn't trying to say anything meaningful about capitalism or the military-industrial complex. This is as simple as kill those bugs, and you know what? Sign me up, I'm ready to enlist. The audio design feeds into this like before, as the soundtrack is just as silly and oddly inspiring as it was in 2017. It's almost satirically patriotic. It gives off an overly serious military tone at times, which already clashes well with the alien ant army we're fighting, but because Earth Defense Force as a whole is so inviting, you may begin to feel a sense of pride when hearing these motivational anthems. You start to fall into a role-playing mindset when playing EDF after a while. I'm doing my part, but you actually are. You're ridding the Earth of these bugs and robots to save humanity. The grandiose, over-the-top style of the soundtrack, with its sick guitar riff sprinkled in, at first blush feels like it's simply adding to the cheeky atmosphere. Given enough time, though, you'll realize that, no, it earns its grandiosity. I truly do feel the EDF pride, and now, I'm non-ironically fighting off these robot invaders. The silly factor sometimes gets blurred by the admittedly cool shit that's happening on screen, and the danger many enemies pose. These wacky flaily boys don't just make me laugh, they terrify me, since they're so damned deadly. Taking them out one at a time feels like you're slowly ridding the world of a disease. Although the civilians often get caught in the crossfire, you're doing it for them, for the people, humanity itself.
That's it. What, we some kinda...
Earth Defense Force.
For the first time ever, I actually found myself wanting a global total kill count. Dead Nation, which is a game I was planning on talking about last October but didn't get around to it, had something similar with its zombie kills and split the players up by country. Imagining something like that for EDF, which is a much more popular game in its own right, sounds like such a good time. Bugs exterminated, Hectors destroyed, and so on. I don't know, I already felt such a strong bond with the squad mates I came across, helping them get armor, earn medals for their account, and picking them up when they fell. Add in knowing you're aiding them and every player out there in some total kill goal sounds awesome. Alas, hopefully in a future game. Thankfully you're able to spread the infectious EDF energy to other players in your party thanks to the many, many different shouts, emotes, songs, and other quick chat callouts available. This is what I was referencing in my 2017 video, where I said it would be cool if we could join in with the NPCs and their chants and rallies. The NPC soldiers will follow your lead, much like in 2017 if they have the red arrow over their head, but this time they audibly respond or join in with whatever it is you yelled.
If we live, I'm buying you dinner.
EDF!
Finally got used to this power frame.
EDF! EDF! EDF!
There are a ton of things for your character to say, and the way they're labeled is just gold. I mean, really, at first glance, what would you imagine the difference is between some of these? It's even funnier, since a few of them have different intonations and cadences even though it's the same voice. One of them is almost a one-to-one impression of Goku screaming. As many as there are in this confusingly iterative list, your NPC boys will join in and shout with you for just about every single one. Well, not the communicative ones, those are mostly for coordinating with other players. Ignore those though, this is the category that counts. Once you've gained enough of a following, which is pretty easy in a few specific missions, the screams and yells can get really loud. It drowns out most of the audio in the game, the only thing being heard across the battlefield being the booming, energetic, and proud voices of the Earth Defense Force soldiers.
So, even airstrikes can't harm Guinness, hmm?
Ambitious giant insects who have once again come back. The EDF deploys.
It's poetic in a way. Nothing can stop us when we work together. You've heard the one in the beginning, but there are two more chants you can get your allies to respond to, which I'll play right now.
Our soldiers are prepared for any alien threats.
The Navy launches ships, the Air Force sends their jets.
And nothing can withstand our fixed bayonets.
The EDF deploys.
Our forces have now dwindled and we pull back to regroup.
The enemy has multiplied and formed a massive group.
We better beat these bugs before we're all turned to soup.
The EDF deploys.
There's actually quite a few more verses to this song, but you don't have a say in when they start. Your allies seem to sing it in certain missions without your involvement. They're extremely difficult to come across, since it already asks that you keep your allies alive more often than not so they're around to start singing, and there's really no telling when they'll decide to do it or in which mission. For example, in Charge Phase 1, I absolutely caught one of them when playing online, so I went back to that mission offline to get a better recording of it. Even though I stuck with them and kept all of them alive the whole level, they didn't sing it this time. Thankfully, this game has enough of a cult following that other people have dedicated their time to uploading all of the possible verses in-game. It gets darker and more depressing as it goes on, but the ending lines are, I think, worth it in the end. From here on out, I'll start splicing those verses in the video where I see fit. For now, here's the one I captured in the tunnels about the Queen.
To take down giant insects who came from outer space.
We now head underground, for their path we must retrace, and find their giant nest and crush the Queen's carapace. The EDF deploys.
The only exceptions to the songs are the wing divers. I don't know why specifically, since you can definitely hear them grunt, speak, and yell, but for some reason when you try to sing when playing as a wing diver, it's completely silent. The game definitely acts as if you did say it, since the allies respond to it, which is strange.
Come back. The EDF deploys.
Maybe they just forgot to have their wing diver voice actors say these lines when recording the English dub. Depending on your point of view, this could be a negative or a positive. It is pretty funny to hear the allies chant the line, "The Navy launches ships, the Air Force sends their jets," over and over without a break. I may or may not have annoyed my friend this way, spamming 2-1 for minutes on end. All of this is phenomenal and enhances the atmosphere in a big way, whether playing alone or with others. However, there's one significant downside to the chat and emotes that almost ruins it completely. I really don't know how this was never addressed, but there seems to be a memory leak or something which seriously slows down the mission select and equipment screens when in online lobbies. People online have guessed that this is related to the emotes and the chat itself, since it doesn't clear out after every mission. At the very least, I can say when playing and not using the chat in any capacity, the slowdown never happened, not once. Basically, the more fun you have caroling along to the EDF jingles in-game, the less fun you'll have when selecting a different class or weapon. Thankfully, this stops when you leave the lobby and start a new one, but that band-aid solution doesn't make the situation feel any less annoying. Finding a good squad isn't the easiest task, so having to pick the lesser of the two evils, sticking it out with an almost unusable menu, or leaving the room and hoping they all join again, doesn't feel great. I should probably mention that some have attributed this to NVIDIA graphic cards specifically, and I also don't know if this problem exists for console players at all. While I'm at it, I'll just mention that the online lobby system is, at the very least, less than ideal. Clearly, some people are confused on how to create a private room, which is done like this. I can see how it would be kind of puzzling, since it's admittedly not very user-friendly, but I certainly don't think the solution is to kick anyone who joins your obviously public lobby. Yeah, just put in a note that says you'll kick anyone who joins, great, that should do the trick. It sometimes takes an excruciatingly long time to find a room that, 1, has players who have a semblance of an idea of what they're doing, 2, won't kick you out, and 3, aren't in the middle of a mission. When 2 and 3 combine together, it's a truly terrible experience. Man, it took you guys a long time to finally finish that mission. Okay, let's finally Oh, they both left. Great. Fine, no one hosts late game lobbies anyway, I'll host my own. And nobody shows up. Even if you luck into a room with a decent squad, 4.1 isn't content to let you have a good time, as it'll often randomly disconnect everyone from the session. Once you see the matchmaking black screen for long enough, you know you're fucked, and most people familiar with the game react appropriately. Getting back on track with the audio again, the voice lines this time around are honestly even better than they were in 2017. I mentioned earlier that the mainline EDF games improve with every entry, and the dialogue seems to be following the same trend. I can't tell you how many times I grinned from ear to ear when hearing some of the things these soldiers say, and often I'd outright laugh.
Go from the right! Easy for you to say. Getting rid of this many bugs is gonna make my wife cry. Possibly. Reloading. Back me up. Understood.
This underground adventure thing is kind of thrilling.
I can't even see my hands in front of my face.
I'm used to the dark. My hometown turned the lights off every night.
You're not shaking. Don't be stupid.
It's big enough to close your eyes and
We
shoot.
got one.
We
Who's
got
next? I'm loading ammo.
I know in Left 4 Dead, they recorded a ton of lines that would trigger in certain situations, and the quantity of them made sure that repeated playthroughs wouldn't feel so samey. Something of the sort had to be implemented in 4.1 as well, since there are an unimaginable amount of voice lines, 24,000 or so, and there's really no telling when soldiers will say what. Many of them are things found in your chat wheel, almost like Sandlot didn't want those audio clips to go to waste, so they jam-packed your quick chat, leaving nothing on the cutting room floor. But there are a seemingly limitless number of lines where NPCs simply talk with one another, react to the situation, or communicate with each other on the radio. Some of them are obviously tied to the events that happen in specific missions, but beyond that, I really don't know what goes into where and when voice lines get triggered. I'd still imagine some of it is based on which mission you're in, but maybe some other variables include how close they are to teammates, how close they are to enemies, how much time has passed in the mission, how much health they have, if they're under your command, and perhaps even how many soldiers are alive or clumped together in a group. Like, seriously, it's sometimes a never-ending cavalcade of ridiculous campy reactions and phrases.
Got it! He's mine!
Prepare for battle.
Yes, sir!
Ready for flight!
Clear spot to stun.
Grease out!
Yes!
Okay!
No matter what happens, annihilate the enemy. Enemies there. Sure. Stay alert. Don't let your guard. No matter what happens to me.
There's so many great bits of dialogue with the story, specifically with the expert Ravager scientist, but I won't get to those just yet. For now, I think I've discussed the audio, campiness, and vibe of EDF long enough. It's time to get into the minutiae of the gameplay mechanics and some changes. A quick flurry of small things first. You can play online with up to 4 people, of course, but what's more, you can revive teammates when they've lost all their health. Again, I'm mostly ignoring Insect Armageddon here, so this is a big step up from 2017, where if your partner died, well, they're gone for good. The intricacies behind the revival are interesting. Up to half of your current health is given to the fallen squad mate. If they have low armor compared to you, they could get their full health bar back without you suffering much of a loss. However, when it's the inverse, it's not so great. The lower armor player gives up half their current health as expected, but the higher armor player is basically left with nothing, since half of 300 or so doesn't even come close to filling up your comparatively beefier health bar. You also can't revive teammates at all if your HP is low enough, which is designated by the bar flashing red. This threshold isn't an absolute value, it's percentage-based. I believe it's 25% of your total health. The healing pickups aren't an absolute value either, they also go off your max HP, and this is something that might take a while to properly come to grips with. 15% of your maximum health is replenished with a small healing pickup, and about a third of your max HP for a big one. This means a healing item has more value when grabbed by players with higher armor numbers relative to their current squad, since the absolute number of hit points restored is at its most efficient. Then they can simply revive their lower armored teammates if needed and disperse the total health that way. I'm not saying this is what everyone should be doing all the time, it isn't an unspoken rule or anything, but that strategy certainly can be helpful in more difficult encounters with an unbalanced team. It can also be much more beneficial during crucial life or death situations to have one squad mate at half health than it is to have 2 at a quarter. One acid spray or spider wire coming in from off screen could doom us both. Many people don't understand this, it seems, and you'll often have your entire team begging to be revived, even though you're the only hope you all have for finishing the mission. If team chat wasn't restricted in some lobbies, I would absolutely love to explain to them that what they're essentially asking is for all of us to die. The item pickups themselves are now 3D boxes instead of 2D sprites, and they even fall down and bounce around the environment. It does make it a bit more tedious to collect everything sometimes, as they might scatter after they've fallen from a great height, but the comical satisfaction from seeing an explosion of items launching every which way after you defeat an enemy makes it totally worth it. Funnily enough, although the visuals took a leap forward, the sound of grabbing items is the same as in 2017. This simple noise is also found in EDF Vibe. I love it, there's no need to update it, I doubt anyone really cares about it, and for me, this little jingle being carried through the games is a bit of a charming tradition. I won't be inherently upset if it's absent in EDF 6 or anything, but I must say, I do like the reuse. The vehicles, which are mostly given to the air raiders, have more health this time around, which is already great, but because you can keep calling them back after enough credits have been earned mid-mission, once they run out of ammo or get destroyed, you can hop to a different one. The helicopter flying in to drop whatever you ordered works in a fun way, since you do need to plan on your placement, otherwise it might land out of reach. However, it would have been really cool if the crate that it drops in dealt damage to enemies as it lands. Maybe taking friendly fire that way would have been kind of frustrating, but I don't think it would be all that different from a teammate's misaimed gunshot or the far more common air raider airstrike mishap. Since fallen ships and other large enemies don't inflict harm when they land after being taken down, maybe the air raider crates being the exception would have felt weird, who knows. Before moving on to the enemies and the missions themselves, I want to discuss the classes more in depth. The Ranger plays basically the exact same way as in 2017, but this time they get the benefit of rolling through objects such as green fences. One of the load screens even mentions it, so you can tell they were proud of getting rid of that previous hassle. It is a little irritating that this only works at the beginning of the roll instead of the entire animation having a hitbox, but it's still a good improvement. The Air Raider, even though they too roll around when they aren't in vehicles, aren't privy to this advanced technique, and green fences could be a hindrance just like they were for the Ranger previously. Something else unique to the Ranger is that whenever they grab a healing item, any NPC followers nearby replenish a small bit of HP. This doesn't really impact much of anything, but it is nice that it's there, and I will admit, I did take advantage of that mechanic when in a couple of tough solo missions. There's a surprising amount to talk about when it comes to the knockdown states and reloading in general. Not all classes handle getting knocked over the same, and while for some circumstances it may prove to be a nuisance, for others it may help your cause. As a Ranger, you can roll to get up faster, the Wing Diver can expend a decent chunk of her jet fuel to prop herself back up and start flying, which also works for the airborne stage of being flung as well, and the Fencer, if timed precisely, can dash the moment they land on the ground to avoid the down state altogether. The air raider doesn't have anything. The moment you lose control of them, it's basically a cutscene until they get back on their feet again. From what I can tell, in most cases, as long as you're on the ground, you won't continue to take damage. It's hard to pin down when the invincibility starts and ends, as I've definitely seen some enemies or weapon types deal damage when I was on the ground, and if you're thrown in the air, you seem to be fair game too. Either way, you can probably see where I'm going with this. Some enemies, such as Hectors, are all or nothing with their shots. They fire and fire and fire until they empty their load. If you get knocked down as a Hector is still shooting, it's sometimes smarter to stay on the ground for as long as possible if it means the Hector wastes their ammo. Every second of invulnerability is another second closer to them having to reload, increasing your odds of survival. As I said though, it's often unclear whether or not you'll truly be impervious to damage. At the very least, certain Hector fire and Queen Bee spikes can still hit you. Regardless of if you're flinging through the air, getting ragdolled by enemies, or down on the ground, these situations where you're trapped could still help you when it comes to reloading your weapons. I've talked in the 2017 video about these lengthy mini load screens and how in this series, this makes some sense given the fact that part of the core gameplay loop is running around to collect items. There doesn't seem to be nearly as long of reload times for the majority of guns found in both games. The only ones I saw that were pretty long were a few with the Fencer and Air Raider. Either way, utilizing these moments where you're incapacitated to reload works about as well as you'd expect, except for the Wing Diver and Fencer. For the Wing Diver it's better, and the Fencer much worse. With the Fencer, there's a lot of weapons which are only useful after you've charged them up a bit. You can see the meter down at the bottom here, and once it's in the yellow is when it changes its animation and starts to do an appreciable amount of damage. These are what the stats look like when in the equipment screen. It's neat, I like it. When you're in the thick of it while dual-wielding, you start to get into a rhythm. For me, it's // dash dash, and repeat. The dashing is to allow time for both to charge up again, but I will admit that the second dash isn't strictly necessary, I just like to keep the momentum. However, getting grabbed or knocked over means your charge will drop all the way down without releasing your attack, and because you can't start a reload in the middle of a down state, you basically went backwards, you lost progress. Losing momentum, charge, and time for a Fencer could be enough in a difficult mission to result in a quick death. I've also found that escaping a grab as a Fencer, especially to the dragon enemies, is a big hassle. The camera sometimes jerks all around, and even though you're holding down the fire button, your weapons might not charge up, and instead he'll go with a wimpy quick slash for some reason. The Wing Diver is the opposite. They take advantage of every lack of control state in the game, even death. The energy tank is their fuel for flight, and is how you reload your weapons. Some take straight from the tank with every shot, while others recharge all at once, only taking from it again once you emptied your clip. With these, they need to be completely refilled, otherwise you can't use them, and reloading early in the middle of a clip uses the same amount of fuel as it would if it were empty, which makes tactical reloads an even more interesting decision. When your tank hits 0, it flashes red and the Wing Diver is basically useless. You can't fly or reload any of your guns, regardless of how they recharge or their maximum capacity. This is why it's smart to have one weapon that has a high capacity with you at all times, for when your tank goes into emergency mode. Emergency mode does have its advantages though, as your fuel comes back at a quicker rate than it does normally. You see how this could be risk versus reward in some cases, and finding the right times to purposely expend all your fuel only to gain it back to 100% is something you'll learn as you get better with her. Mistiming this emergency reload, with no ways to fight back, a light jog at your disposal, and barely a big enough jump to clear a curb, isn't a condition conducive for success. All that being said, we can return to the down states. Not only does your current reloading process keep on going, your tank is automatic, it'll keep recharging no matter the circumstance, and let me tell you, being invulnerable while still close to the action, and getting a refill, it's amazing. Something about making progress while doing nothing is very appealing to me, and that's what this is, essentially. Getting grabbed normally is a net negative, especially as a Fencer and Air Raider, but for a Wing Diver, yeah, sure, I'll take this tick damage while I recharge for a bit. If you're the only one alive, you can even see that the enemies stop attacking, they wait patiently for you to free yourself. With every other class, dying and waiting to be revived is a time when you're basically of no help at all. You can sometimes time it right, equipping your turrets as an Air Raider and somehow chip away at the reload bar while dead, but the Wing Diver always gets that benefit, and it makes a lot more sense to boot. I know I spent a long time talking about something that seems so mundane on the surface, But I hope you can see and maybe appreciate how different these 4 classes handle something as ordinary as being knocked down. Maybe it's a testament to the game's quality, or maybe it's just something very specific that I wouldn't have cared about in a different game, but because I already love EDF, it stood out. Either way. There's still plenty more to talk about with the classes, so let's keep going. There's not a whole lot to say about the Ranger specifically, as in 2017 this was the only class, so most of what I said in that video applies here as well. Air Tortoise isn't quite as fun, since you have to get really close to the enemy for the lock-on to work. The same goes for most of their homing weapons, sadly. You can juggle with the rocket launchers, which is fun, and I'll have more to say about their grenades a little later on. Right now, I want to dive deeper into something I mentioned earlier. Although the Fencer is clearly much faster at top speed than the Ranger is, when going back to the Ranger after long sessions as a Fencer, man, does he feel so easy to control. Oh, I need to move 2 feet to the left for an item? No problem, let me turn around and roll wherever I want. They are the masters at moving exactly where they want to within a radius of about 10 feet. The Fencer's radius is much bigger, however, they are not the masters of their domain. Since they get their speed by dashing, you'll always move that set distance regardless of where you want to end up. If your target destination is half the distance of your dash, sorry pal, you're gonna have to suck it up and waddle your way over there. All this is to say, I think the Fencer's base speed is just too slow. I get what they were going for, and he does feel properly unwieldy, but it's torture when simply trying to walk 5 feet to your left when you are at a standstill. Thankfully, you can revive teammates in the middle of a dash, which is a nice consideration at the very least. The mobility they get when having a few weapon combinations is great for zipping around, but when you get avalanched by a ton of webs or lasers at the same time, you're basically dead meat. As much as the Fencer is supposedly the tank of the team, I found the moments where their sitting ducks completely cancels out their slightly larger health pool. They do get shields, but beyond the parry maneuver, which does come in handy for a few situations, they aren't as useful as I'd want them to be. The angle at which they protect you is very tiny. You can easily get pushed back a great distance depending on what you're blocking, which is very irritating considering how long it would take for your big metal butt to waddle back to that spot. Their maximum durability before having to reload is surprisingly low, especially when you're up against a beefier enemy like a Hector, and you can't preemptively reload your shield like you can with every other gun in the game. Yes, you heard that right, the shields reload in this game. There are quite a few enemies which have attacks that slow you down, which at first blush seems like it would be a nightmare for the wing diver. She already has the lowest health pool, but now her fuel gets depleted and she can't escape danger? Brutal. That said, I think it's actually rougher for the Fencer, and my reasoning comes down to the acceleration factor. When a wing diver is flying, they go at a consistent set speed while holding down the flight button. When you move out of a dead stop, there is a bit of momentum involved, as with changing directions, but ignore that for now. Her fuel being wasted is still rough, but the moment the attack is finished, she starts moving right away again. With a Fencer, all of their potential movement stems from one input, the set distance dash. Those first few starting frames are where all of the acceleration comes from, and because you have to wait for the backpack propulsion animation to finish before being able to dash again, if a web, laser, or Hector gunfire hits you at the exact moment you pressed the dash button, you lose out on all the distance you could have gained, and you're wasting the time immediately afterwards waiting for the dash to become available again. While it is true that all of the classes are only as good as the loadout you choose, because his mobility is tied to the weapons and their harmony with each other, the Fencer, in a strange way, actually feels a bit more restricted than the others. You might pick a melee weapon and a shield just to dash cancel, and then there goes half your offense simply because you're otherwise very slow. I imagine this is why he's given 4 weapon choices. Obviously, dual wielding is just a cool thing on the face of it, but because you might pick something just for its dash or jump ability, it's nice that it's one of quite a few tools in your arsenal while mid-mission. Besides the many nuances of their movement and weapon loadout combinations which I don't unabashedly love, I overall really like the Fencer. Being the guy who can run into a sea of bugs and monsters and not immediately get wrecked felt great. Doubling up on axes and blades is a ton of fun. There's a specific hammer that takes eons to charge up, but then obliterates everything in its wake. Their artillery is so chunky and powerful it can take out dropships with only a few shots, even late-game Earth Eaters. Thanks to the mechanic of big enemies getting stun-locked if you deal a certain percentage of their total health, the Fencer, with their damage-dealing big boy artillery, can even juggle far-away king variants of giant insects and dragons. I just love it. In addition to giving them fun, unique tools, and making their mechanics enjoyable to play around with, Sandlot nailed the feel and sound of a mech-like soldier as well. The audio design and the weight of the controls themselves really lends credence to the idea that these guys are hulking behemoths. Weapons will have varying degrees of recoil, which can be felt with how quickly the reticule moves after you fire, but you may notice that they also work on a momentum system as well. Much like with their walking speed, moving your aim isn't as simple and snappy as it is for the Ranger. Certain guns, it feels like you're dragging it through cement, even though you're moving it as fast as you can. The recoil is so strong on some weapons, it juts your camera directly upwards the moment it finally kicks in. Here's where I start holding down each trigger, there's the kick for the chain gun, and there it is for the flamethrower. I have to hold down on the control stick to get it to aim in the middle of the screen. When you quickly switch to something less unruly, like axes or blades, watch what happens. Yes, I was holding down so hard with the flamethrower that the camera overcorrected itself into the ground the moment I swapped over to the melee weapon. It's incredible, truly. The sound design for all aspects of the Fencer is extremely well done. With artillery fire, you can hear the inner mechanisms of the gun preparing the next shell. The chain gun spinning before it starts firing. And the dash maneuver has a proper machine-esque noise to go along with it too. It also sounds like the wrong trousers from Wallace and Gromit, which makes it all the better. Although I mostly covered everything I wanted to about the Wing Divers when discussing the down states and reloads, there's a few more things to mention. Every other class needs to have their gun out when reloading, but the Wing Divers don't. This is, on its face, an obvious benefit for this class. However, it also manages to make the list of silly weapons more viable. Take, basically, everything in this far right column, for example. These are similar to the turrets the Air Raider gets. They too fire automatically and take an excruciatingly long time to reload. The difference is, the Wing Diver stuff mostly sucks eggs. Yeah, there are times when they can come in handy, but boy are those times fleeting and circumstantial. That said though, because you don't need to have them out to reload, you aren't forced to keep limiting your offense when wanting to recharge it mid-battle. This works well for the Wing Diver specifically, since a few weapons, such as the Rapier and Idun, are basically all you need for a good portion of the missions. This lets you try out these wacky little guys guilt-free. Mostly. It's still safer and more efficient to have a 1-2 combo, such as a long-range laser sniper which pulls from the tank, and something more close range that has a clip when your energy runs out. But hey, I'm not your boss. Use the shitty weapons if you want, I don't care. While you can probably do it once you get higher level gear, the Air Raider seems like the worst class to attempt a solo completion with. So much of their fun equipment requires credits to use, which are given to you for defeating enemies. If you, say, had a bombing run, a satellite blaster, and of course your vehicle, if you didn't kill enough enemies with all of that, well, you might not be able to fight back at all. You could always bring limpet guns to cover your weak spots, since those reload like normal guns, but they aren't good enough to really make much of an impact. As much as I love the idea of the Roombas and Beetle Boys, those aren't either. They do help if you're grabbed by enemies though, unlike most of their other equipment, so I'll give them that. Turrets help as well, but something funny I noticed is if you spam the place turret button while grabbed by a red ant, it could end up on the ant itself, firing away. This is a pretty great visual, however, they disappear when the corpse goes away, which is quite the unfortunate side effect of scrambling when being ragdolled. Being that the ways in which an Air Raider can truly dominate relate to the credit system, I'd imagine this is part of the reason why so many people online choose to be the Air Raider to compensate for their sometimes gap of offense. All that being said, I do think there are other reasons why the Air Raider is selected so much. First off, much of their equipment is for support. Yeah, using a defensive or power buff could help you in solo, but it's obviously more practical with more people. There are even some support tools that help a specific class, such as the plasma battery gun, which recharges a wing diver's energy tank. Since this game is awesome, you can even place it directly on the player themselves, and the radius follows them around. Amazing. The same thing goes for the posts. I had a dude place them on my vehicle, and it came along for the ride, helping me as I went. The other reason I think the aerator is a favorite when online comes down to the vehicles. First of all, they're just rad as hell. Spawning in a giant mech, a tank, a helicopter, it's something you simply can't do in other games, so if someone were to catch word of EDF and give it a go, they'd likely try out the class that can do the things they can't find elsewhere. The wing diver and fencer are a bit hard to come to grips with right away, but the aerator is simple. Walk around, chuck some bombing run flares, and dominate in vehicles. Easy as can be, and it leads to utter destruction. The other benefit is that the vehicles basically act as a shield, a buffer for anyone trying a harder difficulty than they really ought to be trying. Play as a ranger on hard without armor and you likely get wrecked, but as an aerator, the firepower from the mech/tank and extra layer of health might let them skate through where they otherwise wouldn't have. Some of the vehicles themselves also don't do anything when alone, such as one of the helicopters. In the pilot seat, you don't have access to any of the guns, but get a buddy in there and oh man, it's a ton of fun. There's also a multi-seat mech called the Proteus, which has 3 gunner seats in addition to the pilot, and it even shows up in an online-only mission for free. It's really far away though, and I could never manage to get everyone over there to really give it a go. There's a lot of red ants and even some death queens that distract most players. Thankfully I had some teammates who brought them out on the regular, and it was some of the best times I had in the game, taking down an army of Hectors. Something that's also kind of interesting is that for most vehicles, only the aerator and ranger are able to pilot them. The wing diver and fencer can get in the gunner seats if available, and in the back of some ambulances, but they can't drive. The only exception seems to be the walking fortress Balam, and I'd assume it's because of a mission where its usage is basically mandatory. Going along with the praise I gave the fencer, the walking fortress Balam, in addition to the smaller mechs, feel properly machine-like. They did a great job at conveying how heavy and bulky these guys are. Standing up is a slow process, but the fact that they thought to include thrusters to help them get back on their feet is wonderful, and the sound that goes with it is great. I obviously can't go through every vehicle in depth, but I'll say that the mechs are really good, and I'm always surprised that the other aerators seem to favor the tanks, helicopters, and railguns. Helicopters just take so long to finally get in the air, and to me are fairly sluggish when maneuvering the sky. Then again, maybe I'm just too used to the wing diver at this point. Probably my biggest complaint about the aerator isn't all that exclusive to them as a class. The red arc for throws in this game is honestly pretty terrible. It's incredibly difficult to know exactly where your throwable will land. When it comes to the ranger and his grenades, you'll usually have to test many throws to see where it ends up. However, some come with a wind-up animation, which basically undermines the entire process. As bad as that is, I'd argue the aerator has it even worse. The aerator's bombing run flares require credits, kills, for it to recharge, so a botched bombing run throw means you basically just wasted one of your best offensive tools for part of the mission. Holding the throw button will extend the distance, but you can't really gauge where it will land once it stretches out too far, and you don't have control of its length after you start charging up. Even worse, the maximum distance is determined in part by your camera position on the Y-axis. Looking up will give it a better shot at reaching a faraway group of enemies, but now you have even less sight on where it'll land than before. It becomes all too easy to overshoot your target. It's just bad, I really can't stand it. The missiles and satellite weapons work much better. You just have to hold your aim for a second, and then you can direct the missiles or beams or whatever to where you want with the pink laser. As much as the XL coastal missile isn't as practical as the others, the comedy of wondering why the missile hasn't landed on my target yet, only to then see that spot slowly glow as bright as the sun as the big fat boy meanders its way to the destination, was absolutely gold when I used it the first time. I don't have much else to say about the aerator, but there's one specific bizarrity that annoyed me the more it happened. I won't get into the specifics of EDF Vibe too much right now, since this is a 4.1 video, but you basically start that game as a civilian. The first however many missions, you aren't truly in the EDF. In fact, you more resemble a construction worker and a Power Ranger on Halloween, I guess. However, the air raider can still call down specific satellite weapons and bombing runs, all the while the NPCs chatter on the radio, flabbergasted that a civilian has access to EDF technology.
A civilian ordering an air raid? Never heard of anything like this.
This makes enough sense. The characters are responding to the situation like you might expect. This isn't the case in 4.1. You're a member of the EDF the entire time. As an air raider, you've been requesting vehicles and signaling where to send missiles and airstrikes for the whole game no problem. For some reason, the satellite weapons, specifically Spritefall, have this radio chatter play each time it's ready for use and each time you use it.
Unauthorized access to satellite orbit weapon detected. Spritefall is being taken over. Oh, someone is accessing the satellite orbit weapon Notune. Illegal access to Notune. Somebody is starting up the satellite blaster. Unauthorized access to satellite orbit weapon detected. The satellite blaster is being taken over.
Like, what on earth? Of course I know the person accessing Spritefall. He's me. It just makes no sense, and not in the fun, campy EDF way, but in a why did they do this way.
The Air Force and the Navy were destroyed or cast about. Scouts, Rangers, wing divers have almost been wiped out. Despite all this, the infantry will stubbornly hold out. The EDF deploys.
All of the basic enemies from 2017 made a return, but there were quite a lot of new ones created for this game, and the pacing of their introductions is something I've come around to quite a lot. Black ants are what kicks off the horrifying realization that after 7 years, the Ravagers are back. In fact, the description for the beginning mission is kind of fun. It says there were reports of giant insects, but it's probably a prank after all these years. The commitment to continuity and world building is awesome to see, and much of that continues with the in-level dialogue, which I'll get to in a bit. There's a few missions with just the black ants, albeit with a slightly altered moveset. The black variants usually only spray acid, and the red ants are the ones that can grab you, but in the opening the black ones chomp on civilians and soldiers. Maybe this was simply done for the visual of ants with humans in their mouths at the start, but black versions to keep their health as low as possible. Anyway, the next enemy type that gets shown off isn't the usual spiders, or the red ants, or even the Hectors. It's a new spider variant, which is dubbed the Retarius. This is the first instance of the Ravager scientist showing his ego, by the way. Have a listen to him choosing the name of these spiders.
This is O'Hara. Soldiers, I would like to name the new giant insect Retarius. Retarius catches its prey in a net. Take extra caution.
What is his basis for naming them that? No idea, but his word is final, I guess. The Retarius is... Retari spawn with pre-built webs, shoot out their silk, and pull you into their lair. One annoyance about being caught is you can't influence your speed at all. This is most notable with wing divers, since generally I'd want to fly closer to the one who has me in their grasp so I can kill it. Well, you'll just waste your fuel. You're getting dragged at this speed no matter what. While I'm at it, I'll also say that the webs themselves have a very large amount of health. I'd say sometimes too large. Shooting them down is the solution for when you've become caught in them, and you can preemptively remove them from the battlefield, but it takes quite a lot of firepower. Since the Retari can't weave webs mid-mission, I'd imagine this was Sandlot's workaround to keep the webs a threat for most of the level. The sound they make when they take damage is kind of sad. They almost have a cute animal type of cry. Hilariously, these are supposedly the Ravager's answer to the wing diver units. The intercom people talk as if this was the Ravager's way of combating the new EDF unit that they've been working on for the past 7 years.
Does it mean they knew what we were doing?
Humans made wing divers in order to eliminate the giant insects. But the Ravager technology has evolved beyond that.
Does this mean that the progress of the giant insects exceeds human wisdom? Progress faster than science is impossible, but...
I get it, because they're like flies and can get caught in the webs, but I don't know, they're really easy to avoid, so anytime I see NPC wing divers caught and crying out for help, it's hard not to look down on them for it. They don't even try to shoot their way out either, and you know what Zoidberg says.
I help those who help themselves!
Anyway, the last thing I want to mention about this enemy is their intro, like the first few seconds of their first level intro. You start under a bridge where all you can see are the webs, then slowly you'll walk forward and uncover this brand new foe. Super cool. In the first underground mission, you fight through black ants for quite some time, until the final wave, where you come across the spiders from 2017. I think the idea is that the Ravagers have been breeding these insects for the past 7 years underground. At least, that's what the NPCs say. There's missions with them, black ants, and the Retari in different locations, waves, and setups, which is basically how the formula works for all of this. Essentially, new enemy, oh no! Then for the next couple of levels, they'll likely be the focus, then start to get intermixed with everyone else. 10 or so levels in, the mothership makes a dreaded return, which was the final boss in 2017, if you remember. We can't fight it yet, but its ominous presence certainly foreshadows it as being a significant threat. Then the flying drones get dispensed, then killable dropships, the Hectors, and even the walking fortress. Each gets their own revival mission, and are treated with the same level of importance as in 2017. I love this, as while the dialogue does properly respect that, yes, these are enemies you've seen before, because 4.1 is more accessible than 2017 is, and has online multiplayer, giving the newcomers the same ride as veterans had previously is a great consideration. The Walking Fortress introduction mission is really difficult, as it spits out a ton of Hectors. However, the best part about it is the opening dialogue from the soldiers. They bring in a huge tank with something called the Requiem gun in an attempt at taking out the fortress.
All infantry fall back! We'll handle this!
It clearly misses, like, obviously undershoots it, doesn't make contact at all. Then they immediately conclude that the Requiem gun didn't work.
It didn't do shit, sir! Fall back!
Incredible, guys. Great work. A few missions later, a new robot variant called the Shield Bearer gets introduced alongside some Hectors, and these are some of the most interesting enemies in the game. They don't directly deal damage, well, besides when they launch your tank into the air by sheer luck. Instead, they only exist to protect other Ravagers, be it ants, spiders, Hectors, Deroys, or even enemy spawners. Their AI is pretty decent in 4.1, they actively seek out something to protect. When they're stationary, their shield is very big, and when they're on the move, it's a lot smaller. This change in size is pretty clever, since it isn't as straightforward as you might think. Sometimes it is better to refrain from shooting them, to keep the shield from shrinking and blocking your shots against other enemies, or to simply protect against errant airstrikes. The shield bearer being the air raider's biggest foil is honestly perfection. Don't nerf the strong bombing runs and coastal missiles, instead give the player a reason why this isn't always the solution. This provides teammates with a high priority target so as to open up one of their allies' best weapons, or forces the air raider to try out some other strategies and utilize other weaponry. They're also both the obvious support unit of their squad. Air raiders can help indirectly with the EDF soldiers, and shield bearers protect the bugs and Hectors. I love it. Just like with the Walking Fortress, the introductory mission for the shield bearer has some things about it that are pretty funny. The Air Force won't take no for an answer, and will drop airstrikes twice throughout this mission in an attempt at taking out this new threat. You and I both know that it won't work, and our EDF leaders do argue with them.
Air Force, are you planning to continue the pointless air raids?
Should I order them to withdraw?
The Air Force has honor too. Let them try.
But they keep doing it anyway, regardless of how much progress you've made. If you're simultaneously too fast, but also too slow, you may end up in the worst of both worlds, where you kill all of the Hectors and the shield bearer, only for the air raid to commence and land squarely on you. As annoying as it is, since it undermines the progress you could have already made, and kills you in the process if you didn't wait patiently on the sidelines, I kind of like this. This gives off the impression that we really don't know what we're dealing with, and the military branches all have their own ideas on how to approach these new threats. It's a cool little set-piece moment. That isn't the funny part, however. When realizing that the shields block out our attacks, but not the enemy attacks, we get one of our soldiers saying this.
So they only screen out our shots, huh? We're blocked! There's no way! We can't even hit them! But they can hit us? This game is rigged!
You gotta love it.
Shield screens don't interfere with each other when they overlap? That seems like it should be illegal!
Then there's the Ravager scientist guy, who can't hide his enamoration with the Ravagers and their advanced technology. Just listen to his tone when discussing the shield bearers.
Distinguish friendly attacks from enemy attacks. Their technology is so advanced.
Those Ravagers are so advanced. Yeah, man, which side are you on again? The Red Ants get introduced in the same way as the original Spiders in a tunnel mission as a surprise final wave. Both the red ants and regular spiders are the scariest insects in the game for me, especially when on higher difficulties. Yeah, the acid spray from black ants eventually gets kind of nuts, but the spider wire that gets thrown out builds up to a comical degree. When playing as a wing diver, I'm far more frightened of a dozen of these landing on me than getting caught in the Retarius web, or being pulled in by them. The red ants grab you, much like another enemy I'll talk about, and good lord can it be difficult to escape. A teammate can come to your aid, and there's even a little warning exclamation mark near their name when they're caught like this, but if you're alone or everyone else is busy, you have to fire back at them while being ragdolled to break loose. This can be tedious and finicky with the wing diver and fencer, since some of their weapons have charge-ups which don't always charge up like you want, which I already kind of touched on before, but really, the air raider has it the worst. If your loadout happens to be one indirect damage dealer like an airstrike and one utility weapon like a guard post, you're fucked. You can't do anything, you just have to hope they for some reason let you go before you lose all your health. It's nearly a soft lock, and all but guaranteed death if no one is around to help you. There's a few queen variants of insects like in 2017, but I won't get to those quite yet. Although it isn't a level that introduces a new threat, I can't help but talk specifically about brute force. This is a gigantic battle against a whole host of enemies, but the visual of the Hectors all lined up in the beginning, and then near the middle when they get reinforcements, it's like something straight out of an anime or a big-budget war movie. It also just goes to show that the environment itself can play a big role in the flow of battle and provide variety to the pacing of the campaign. This is just a flat stretch of grass, nothing to hide behind or block your sight. The only thing working against you is the shield bearers, which is an interesting dilemma for this fight. If those weren't there, this would be a far easier mission, but because you can't simply blast them from far away with ease, you're forced into close quarters combat. Great stuff. Speaking of anime earlier, Sandlot pulls something clever about 40 missions in. We're set to square off against the Mothership? Just as a reminder, there were 53 missions in EDF 2017, the 53rd being the fight with the Ravager Mothership. There's a lot of hopelessness when the colossal flying structure shows more and more forms and weapons, but the EDF wins the day. Holy shit, we did it? But here's where the game starts to get really interesting. So far, you've mostly encountered things you've seen previously, plus shield bearers and a new spider variant. It almost reads as an expedited 2017 campaign with some small modifications. There was even an obvious farming level with a bunch of red ants. We didn't truly take down the Godzilla enemy type this time, but besides that, the Walking Fortress and Mothership were successfully destroyed. This already makes some sense. The EDF has been preparing for a potential Ravager reinvasion for the last 7 years, so the timeline being sped up, and being able to take down these behemoths without as much trouble, just shows that our efforts weren't in vain. But the Ravagers have a Super Saiyan sense of humor, not willing to show their true form until they deem their opponent worthy, I guess. Besides a few brand new enemies, the Ravagers actually seemed to resurrect the ghost of Global Defense Force, reintroducing a few oldies to join the fight against the humans. If you remember, the first 2 games, Monster Attack and Global Defense Force for the PS2, released for Japan and Europe, but not for the West. 2017 was, in a way, a scale back from what the second game offered. The Pale Wing was a secondary class in that game, which of course wasn't in 2017 at all. It's now been revamped into the Wing Diver this time, and enemies such as the flying ant Sauris and Deroys make a comeback as well, albeit with a new coat of paint. The Arginnis has already been introduced, but the bees and Deroys, in addition to a ton of other new stuff, slowly make their way into the latter half of the game. The bee, or wasp, or whatever introduction is presented as the counter to the Wing Diver again, much like the Retarius. Early on in the game, the NPCs referenced that we're the only ones with flying soldiers, and between the first mention of the bees and their arrival, they're in utter denial about the possibility that insects could fly, even the Ravager scientist guy.
Are the wing divers here yet? No matter how much the giant insects evolved, they can't fly.
The giant insects can't fly, so it'll be a one-sided fight.
What's going on? Giant insects can't fly? There's no way the wing divers would lose.
Really weird that these Earthlings are so baffled at the idea of flying bugs, especially considering that the Queen Ants in 2017 obviously had wings.
And stop their progress. If Retarius has spawned there, we might have to expect more new species coming out later. There is a danger that the flying insects may have evolved, and they could be superior to our wing divers. We can never let the giant insects take over the Earth.
Anyway, they're initially a decent counter to the Wing Diver, since for most of the game at that point, you could basically clear missions by flying towards enemies and drop ships to fire your high-damage close-range weapons. Well, the bees fly away, making that tactic at worst impossible, and at best, very inefficient. However, once you equip some adequate long-range lasers, you realize they're a lot like the Retarius webs. Not much of a threat to Wing Divers at all. I do like the foreshadowing. The NPC dialogue talking about them happens in Mission 5, whereas they officially show up around 40 or so, but the fact that the Wing Divers were wiped out by the Wasps, and that's what got everyone all worried? It just makes me think even less of the Wing Diver NPCs. However, playing on Hardest and Inferno for a while got me thinking. The bees are genuinely a major threat on those difficulties, second only to the spiders in my opinion. Maybe what's really going on is that Inferno is what's canon. While you can tackle plenty of things with ease on normal, the NPC soldiers are toughing it out on the canon difficulty, which is why they mostly just serve as decoys. That would perfectly explain how the Wing Divers were apparently all wiped out by the bees. I'm not sure if that explains them flying into the webs, but either way.
Our friends were all killed yesterday, as were our families. Today we may not make it facing these atrocities. We'll never drop our banner despite our casualties. The EDF deploys.
While the mothership was an intimidating beast of a floating fortress, that's nothing compared to the new Earth Eaters. Gigantic hexagonal ships connected together, some spawners of enemies, some giant guns, some containing a myriad of auto-turrets, and some are just their weak spots. This is honestly one of the most horrifying things the Ravagers created. In a few of the missions, it almost completely engulfs the sky, and you can just imagine their plan was to wrap the entire planet in this protective coating, murdering and destroying everything in sight. Everyone is properly terrified of it, but I have to say, fuck man, this could have looked so much cooler. If this blocks out the sky, then it blocks out the sun, and imagining the terrain slowly getting darker and darker, maybe even as dark as the tunnels, with the only light coming from the Earth Eater's lights and guns itself? Man, that sounds rad as hell. Hopefully in a future game. In the missions where the Earth Eaters get teased, we're introduced to quite a few new things basically at the same time, almost to show that, oh shit, the Ravagers are far from defeated. The hexagonal ships appear overhead, a new dropship type teleports itself in frame, and a new flying vehicle, apparently called Flight Vehicle, get dispersed for us to fight. The latter two boast more health than their weaker counterparts and behave somewhat differently as well. Normal dropships open up their hatch, so you can only fire when underneath them. The new ones rotate their protective shell, granting a huge target to fire at. The flight vehicles are slower than the drones, but they're much more difficult thanks to their higher health pool and debilitating laser fire. When gunships were all over, this could happen too, but even a couple of these blue silver boys attacking at once could lead to your death, especially as a wing diver or fencer. I've already gone over that earlier when discussing the classes and downstates, but I do want to mention that this is one of the reasons Hectors are so scary. Even one could manage to kill you if you aren't careful, since they could come equipped with ridiculously powerful plasma shots, always accurate rapid gunfire, and this time even shields. If a couple of them group up, the moment you start to get blasted, your health will take a dive, as will your speed, almost guaranteeing your demise. I do think their expert accuracy paired with their impeding firepower is a bit too difficult sometimes, but at the very least, they stay a threat long after you become comfortable with the game. Plus, if you time it right, you can launch their shots back at them with the fencer, or fire at their arms to throw off their aim. There's a lot of mutant varieties of normal enemies in this game, which are usually painted a different color, but the Hector mutant looks the same. The difference with them is they walk much faster than normal. This caught me off guard during the first all-Hector mission in the city. It really throws a wrench in whatever order you had planned for taking them all out. The third encounter with Erginus is the one where we finally take him down, the solution being the giant Rock'em Sock'em robot. The dialogue from the general here is pretty funny. Have a listen.
Alarm pilot, use the fortress's arm controls to physically strike the enemy. Accelerate your mass to maximize the force of the impact.
Just punch him in the face.
Going along with how exaggerated the Hectors react when being shot, the added Deroys feel just as goofy. When they land from a dropship or get shot by powerful weaponry, they basically become an accordion. They're very stretchy. These guys can really put up a fight if you don't know the best strategy, and when playing on my solo completion with the Ranger on normal, this all-Deroy mission was one of the big roadblocks for me. If you get too close, their leg lasers can start dealing damage, but they also start stabbing with their feet blades, which knocks you over and is fairly hard to avoid. You can destroy those individual laser sections on their legs, and even their bladed tips, but that's practically a trap. Destroying their offense feels like it should be a net positive. You're working to remove what's dealing damage, but really, once you fire some heavy-hitting long-range weapons at their center, they go down without that much hassle. It's only when you have close-range gear and stumble over trying to destroy the difficult-to-hit leg hitboxes that they start winning the fight. They are an intimidating foe, and the larger variant specifically gets really high up, so if your guns either don't have proper range or don't have a fast bullet time, you might find yourself having to inch closer to their danger zone so you can finally hit them. Leading your shots against Oroys especially is hard because of their flaily and unpredictable movement patterns. Although there's a lot of dialogue that's great and worthwhile to listen for, in the midst of the many callbacks to the previous Ravager invasion 8 years ago, you'll begin to hear murmurs about something very interesting. In quite a few separate instances, you'll hear chatter from the other EDF soldiers about the legendary hero, the soldier who single-handedly took down the alien mothership all those years ago. There's doubts on if that person even exists, if it's a myth, and so on, but some people have guessed that that person is now a member of the current Storm team.
You heard the story? The hero rumor?
Too many times. After destroying the motherships, he disappeared.
Yeah, but that man returned. I heard he's in the Storm team now.
Do you really believe that? Well, whatever. I want to talk about happy things when it gets dark like this.
This is a really nice touch, and one I doubt people would even have been upset about if it wasn't included. The EDF soldiers talk all the time about crazy stuff, so there being a few lines dedicated to this rumor referencing the last game's finale likely won't make new players feel like they're missing out on something crucial or anything, but at the same time it makes the game all the better for veterans, since not only is the game acknowledging the previous entry, the characters are acknowledging your incredible feat from before. It is ridiculous that one person turned the tide in this alien war, but it happened. I know, since I was there. I love it, and the soldiers hypothesizing that the legendary hero is in Storm Team is hilarious. Like, yeah, of course I am, I was in Storm Team last time too. I know the verses of the military song have gotten more and more depressing, but the final one makes it all worth it.
2 days ago my brother died, next day my lover fell. Today most everyone was killed, on that we must not dwell. But we will never leave the field, we'll never say farewell. The EDF deploys.
Stop that depressing crap! Then how about this song? A legendary hero soon will lead us to glory. 8 years ago he sunk the mothership,
says history. Tomorrow we will follow this brave soul to victory. The EDF deploys.
This character, this godlike figure in these soldiers' minds, gives them hope. It gives them the strength to go on, to feel like they can accomplish this impossible task. Silent protagonists in games usually have some form of disconnect between us and the character, but here, on paper, it's egregious. This legendary hero is right here, guys. Hey, how are you? You of course have the chat wheel, but that's the equivalent to Link screaming as he swings his sword and falls off a ledge. This common trope that's present in many games, something that's so easily ignored for the sake of suspension of disbelief, is turned into a critical element in maintaining the faith of the EDF soldiers.
Did you know? 8 years ago, one Storm Team member destroyed the mothership. Unfortunately, no one has seen him since that battle. He is my hero. Someday, I want to be a warrior as good as him.
Your character's silence, and in turn, the growth of this rumor, which eventually becomes gospel, is inspiring the last bastion of hope for all of humanity. I just think this is all really fun. It could have so easily been a straight-up continuation, where the soldiers know you're the same guy, and that's that. Let's start this second alien war. This is far and away the more interesting choice to make, and it fits right in with the camaraderie and pride 4.1 gets the player to feel at times. My only criticism is that the chants aren't guaranteed to play. These verses that I've had you listen to aren't doled out like the other scripted dialogue is. The downwards trajectory of the song, where it gets more and more hopeless, to then upswing at the end when referencing the hero, it's too important to be left to chance. It should have been a mandatory piece of audio near the end. Quite a while into the game, we get introduced to another new enemy type, the dragons. The way the NPCs talk about them is really strange. They conclude that this is the final evolution to the giant insects. This is their final form.
The Ravagers dropped the giant insects and waited for them to evolve. The evolution of giant insects. It's clear this was their plan from the start. And finally they reached their final form. They are larger and stronger. The old giant insects don't compare to this.
Very odd. The dragons do a lot of fire breathing and dive bombs, the latter being the best time to take a clump of them out. It can get overwhelming at times, especially on higher difficulties, but if you keep moving and don't get caught, it's not as bad. I've already talked about their grabs before, so I won't repeat the same complaint. They, much like every other enemy type, get focused on for a few missions as the sole threat, then slowly get interspersed with the others later on. Those first couple levels, though, are really challenging and time-consuming if you're cautious enough. I remember trying to complete this as a fencer on normal in online lobbies, which was likely harder than an offline mode due to the supposed enemy health and damage multiplier, and good lord, it took so long. I hit the same roadblock when on hard mode as the wing diver. Again, I was going solo in an online lobby, which means my weapon choices weren't as expansive as they would have been offline, and the multipliers made them more damaging. I ended up getting through it thanks to a homing weapon I barely ever touched. It's not like I wanted to solo these bad boys, it's just that hardly anyone hosts late-game missions for some reason. I think these guys have the best spawning arrival out of any other enemy type. You can see them pop up on your minimap, but they fly in from out of sight, slowly appearing in the distance high up in the sky. It's a nice visual. As much as I'd like to leave my preferences not so black and white, the dragons are simply my least favorite enemy in the game. I'll talk about the DLC missions after the main ones are done, but that first batch of 26 levels really solidified this hatred for me. They are irritatingly fast in the air, and they clutter the screen to an unnecessary degree whenever they're paired with ground units and dive bomb to join in on the fray. Maybe a part of it is their breath attack as well, since it's just the simple fire visual effect like everything else, thus when it accumulates in your face it blocks everything else out. I know a part of the charm to this series is its classic arcadey craziness, but I do think it gets to be too much. It's hard to even know what's going on in some cases, so figuring out the best path out of the madness, such as shooting at a Hector's arm to clear up the screen, just isn't feasible sometimes. The final fight with the Arginnis is quite the spectacle. We have the answer, Walking Fortress Palam, but instead of giving us another one-on-one fight with them, the game flies in a dozen or so NPC-operated mechs to fight off a wave of like 20 of them. Your job is to fire at the Arginnises now and then, and clear out any giant insects that spawn on the map, as they deal damage to the mechs, and they supposedly weren't designed to fight small bugs. Even though I have had some squad mates spawn them in to fight giant bees. After a while, more Arginnises come to fight, thus we send in more Walking Fortress Balams. Then, near the end, a red giant Arginnis appears. The Ravager scientist has a lot of things to say in this mission, and I think all of them are very silly.
Arginnises. What horrible creatures. Perhaps there's a planet out there where they rule the ecosystem. It must be hell for everything else that lives there. How could the Ravagers ever catch those creatures? Perhaps they catch them as babies and then... Oh dear.
It's just weird that he jumps to the conclusion that on whatever planet these guys are from, this isn't the size of a lot of other stuff. Yeah, for human-sized things it would be a nightmare, but what evidence do you have, with all of these giant insects we've seen already, that their planet has life forms that would be constantly afraid of these guys? When the red mutant variation shows up, our soldiers know he's stronger since he's red.
Look at that one! It's red! Red means it's stronger! Oh, we're screwed!
They're not wrong. The Ravager scientist then says this.
That must be the species' full-grown form! I imagine it grew up here on Earth. Not even Ravagers could wrangle anything that large. It's the pinnacle of evolution, you might say.
Yeah, totally, man. This one definitely grew up on Earth. No way the Ravagers could have wrangled him up. Okay, pal. What are your credentials again? Finally, they send in another Walking Fortress Balam, but this one is for the player to pilot. They actually send in as many as the total number of players, so everyone can join in on the fun of walking gargantuanly slow to hopefully get one punch in. I think firing from the ground is a better play here. It's hard to get a word in edgewise with all of the Balams walking around. While the ants and spiders come from underground, the bees apparently come from this bug nest. There's not a whole lot to say about it. The first mission you don't destroy it but run away. The second mission you do destroy it. It's kinda neat, and it is somewhat satisfying to take down. Another giant robot enemy ship thing gets thrown our way, but this time it's the size of a mountain. Literally, robots don't even get this big in comic books. Hey, don't look at me, the EDF soldier said it.
This is too much, even for aliens. It's bigger than a mountain! It is 300 meters! Robots don't even get this big in comic books!
It's called Argo, and it's pretty cool. It has two phases, one as a flying ship, and the other as a robot dude. These don't show up in many non-DLC missions, only 2 in total, but I do think the other level they're in works really well, since they feel like a centerpiece to the hectic action. In fact, something that's interesting about this level specifically is how it compares to one early on. It's no secret that many environments get used more than once, with the enemy layout, enemy types, NPCs, starting position, and possible additional enemy waves being moved around or changed. There really aren't that many new settings compared to 2017, but it feels like that's not what this game's focus was. After all, we got the 4 classes, a revamped multiplayer, and a whole host of new enemies. 4.1 is overall a great refinement over its predecessor, so there not being a ton of new locations is fine. It's the same story after all, a continuation. I'm not bothered by the fact that many areas feel like we've cleared them out already, but impressed at how the enemies themselves and some other variables can really make an old level feel new. These 2 missions, the latter with the Argo, feel wildly different from each other, and this beach area is even home to a couple other battles as well. Like I said earlier, there's mutated and oversized versions of a lot of enemies in the game. Red bees, red drones, red Erginus, red dragons. Those are fine. I don't have a problem with a different color being used to designate a bigger health bar or anything, which is something I've already touched on in my Insect Armageddon video. The King Spider and Queen Ant are basically the same as they were in 2017, but the new Queen Wasp is exponentially more deadly than the smaller variants. Not only is their accuracy way better, but it knocks you down and out of the sky. As a wing diver and defensor, these are the top priorities once everyone becomes aggroed. They need to die first. The giant needles also block your view, which just goes back to my point from earlier. I'm just not a fan of the screen becoming an unreadable mess. It's bad enough that the camera, when looking up at the sky towards high enemies, sometimes gets obstructed by the environment or even your character model or vehicle. It simply shouldn't be this challenging to have a clear view of the action. The Greater Wild Dragon is the king version of the supposedly evolved giant insects. The dragons, I mean. As much as I don't like the regular dragons, I actually kind of like fighting this guy. It gives off Monster Hunter vibes. Him being fast while flying back and forth feels totally fine given that he's a much larger target, and there's only one of him. My only grievance is with his fire breath attack. There's 2 annoyances, and one of them can be said for the red spray from the Queen Ants as well. When flying as a wing diver, if it doesn't outright kill you, you'll basically be stuck in mid-air. It completely halts your movement. This is damaging enough as it is. I don't think this was something that should slow down the wing diver or fencer as much as it does. The other problem I have with the Greater Wild Dragon's fire breath is that it's incredibly deceiving for more ways than one. First off, it clearly keeps damaging you after the mist completely vanishes. It's tough to know where to stand given that the air itself could suddenly gain damage-dealing properties. There is a part of me, however, that thinks this could be related to the other way this attack is deceiving. Normally when you take damage, it happens immediately. Your health bar adjusts the moment you get hit. In other games, when this isn't the case, often the speed at which your health drops says something about how much damage it will inflict overall. If you get hit by a dragon breath head-on, which is understandably very damaging, your HP will drop in a very quick fashion. When you're on the outskirts though, and the red after effect moves over your character, it seems like it should stop not too long after it begins given how slow it's ticking down, but it just keeps going and sometimes kills you. Is this the work of the invisible hitbox like I mentioned earlier, or is this a completely different effect of the red mist having delayed and prolonged damage time? I don't know, but whatever the cause is, I don't like the end result. The brain is the equivalent to the mothership in 2017. It's usually always accompanied by Earth Eaters, which serve to protect the weak spot, and of course work as its offense. There's a crater mission close to the end which is enjoyable, if also very challenging, in which it eventually flies off after you deal enough damage to it. The final battle is shades of the final mission in 2017, and it's fitting that in both climaxes, the main enemy has you firing at the sky itself. Really, Earth Defense Force is a series of oversized enemies and destructible buildings, so why not make the last boss of the game a gigantic destructible structure? There's 2 rounds of the normal Earth Eater shenanigans, but this time there's so much in the way of turrets. You might find yourself having to clear out the automated firepower and hold off on the main assault for a while. Once the brain has faked its death, it turns Super Saiyan 3, bringing in new forms of the Earth Eaters. This variant being red, of course, since as we all know at this point,
red means it's stronger!
I actually think the red variants are much easier, given that you can hit them anywhere and they'll take damage. This is the ending to the story. This final push by the Ravagers was staved off, and this version of Earth is saved. How do I know it's so conclusive? Well, let me explain. The EDF mainline series, so far anyway, works in sets of 2. Monster Attack and Global Defense Force were their own thing, 2017 and 2025, or 4.1 in this case, are their own thing, and EDF Vibe starts as its own thing, the alien invaders attacking Earth for the first time again. If this pattern is intentional by Sandlot and is what they're going to continue to do, I think that's pretty neat. This way, we get the first contact and initial devastation, which is interesting, and a follow-up after humanity and the aliens get a chance to build themselves back up. I see more value in that than another time around where neither really makes as significant a leap as they did between the first encounter and the rematch. There's a few minor things about the missions as a whole I didn't quite get to before, or want to expand on. While the medals are rigidly only awarded to that specific difficulty per class, it also doesn't combine online and offline together. This means my complete normal playthroughs on normal as the Wing Diver and Ranger don't get added to my online percentage, which is a little unfortunate. This could have something to do with how the armor and weapon limits work. Essentially, in offline mode, I can skate by a mission or 2 on a harder setting, then breeze through normal or easy with those higher level weapons. This is fine, since you're not harming anyone else, who cares? However, someone coming in and breezing through in a public lobby could hurt someone else's experience. I'd say, for the most part, I can appreciate this system. Even when I saw a person with 20,000 armor come help me with the normal mission, I knew that because the armor and weapon limits were in place, they couldn't stomp everything out of existence without me even participating. To an extent, like I said earlier, you can still solo levels without too much trouble depending on the difficulty setting, but it's far better than if the limits weren't there at all. I'm not sure if players cheesing the easy difficulties with good equipment is a good reason to not sync the medals, though. You could argue it's because of the number of missions being different between online and offline, but why not just carry them over for those that are in both sets? My main annoyance with this isn't the medals itself, it's the unlocking of missions. If you finish the game twice offline, that doesn't matter. You can't host anything except the missions you've played online. This goes both ways. If you played online all the way through, not all offline missions will be available. Everything I said unfortunately applies to the DLC missions even more. The DLC missions are much more difficult than the base game, and when playing offline, it isn't too big a deal. You can use all the armor and best weapons to have an edge on normal, sure. But this isn't the case for online. The weapon and armor limits are still present. I get that they're supposed to be a big step up in challenge, but restricting your selection so harshly to not even be allowed to use equipment you can use near the end of the base game is ridiculous. Eventually, someone thankfully joined my efforts in an online lobby, which was pretty surprising given that seemingly nobody hosts these DLC missions at all. I can somewhat understand this for a couple reasons. They're harder, not everyone has access to them, and they don't count for your usual online completion. Each mission pack gets its own percentage exclusive to that DLC. There are also fewer levels to pick from, so you'd have to hope that people are okay with playing one of these 26. It would have likely been a smoother experience for everyone if the DLC missions could be selected in normal lobbies, or both DLC packs combined into one mission pack as far as hosting a lobby is concerned, with 50 or so levels to pick from. However, I don't really care about that, to be honest, since I don't like the DLC much. The different colored enemies aren't bad, and I quite like the green ants specifically, but so much of this content feels slapped together. Without the light structure that the story provides in the main campaign, and the proper pacing to introduce new threats and build upon ideas as they go, these end up feeling like community-made gimmick maps. Random events occurring for no reason, gigantic enemies mushed together without much care. Yeah, it's hard, but for what purpose at this point? Give me the keys to the kingdom. I could make missions just as hard as these, if not more. What's that? One more Golden Queen Ant coming right up! This probably all sounds absurd, since you could make this complaint about many of the base game levels too. Demon Army, the one with the 3 giant nests, feels very reminiscent to a few of these DLC missions. The thing is, as a one-off, that felt mostly fine. I liked the change of pace. Then again, there was also Legion of Monsters, which I didn't hate either. I guess I don't know how to properly explain my apathy towards this content. On one hand, this mostly does feel like a progression from the main game missions. Besides creating wholly new enemy types or settings, adding more giant bugs and mixing the placements up is about all they can do. I think the heart of the issue is it just doesn't feel like these belong anywhere. It's as if time is at a standstill when all of this is going on. Maybe it would have been better to get different voice actors for the intercom radio people, to give us the impression that this is happening in different parts of the world while Storm Team is doing their thing. Really, my biggest takeaway from the DLC was the realization of how much the dialogue, pacing, and overall story structure serves to benefit my enjoyment of playing EDF. When those get stripped away, it's hard not to see this as an Earth Defense Force skinned tab simulation in a way. At least that's how I see it. Once I realized that I didn't care about these levels as much as the others, I decided to abandon the only brave soldier who came to my aid, and abruptly left when we both died in Mission 12. I figured, hey, at least in offline, I'll be able to utilize my full armor pool and use overpowered weapons. But of course, I got bamboozled and was forced to play through the boring first B stage all over again, since the mission unlocks aren't synced between online and offline. Great. Now, don't get me wrong, I didn't hate all of this. Mission 10 was probably the most unique of the DLC levels. It's one my friend and I quite enjoyed when we played it on the PS4. Bug spawners will pop up continuously, but all over, including the walls. The faint red glow they give off makes them easier to spot for fast removal, but it also looks nice in and of itself. It gives an eerie vibe to this level, which isn't something I can say about many other missions in 4.1. Mission 12, the one many admit to be fairly brutal, I found to be pretty fun. The Argo being the centerpiece in a hectic battle seems to be a winning formula for me, since I loved it here, and the 2 walking fortresses wandering around, along with the Hectors scattered here and there, makes it feel like something out of the base game. Take my opinion with a grain of salt, though, since I clearly had better weapons than the game thinks I should. I did, at one point, up the difficulty to try to even the scales, but the absurd quantity of queen ants, queen bees, and their awful spray spike combo turned me away from that idea altogether. Hey now, enough with the negativity. Right, so I ended up really liking the green ants, particularly because of their size and movement speed differences. There's a darker shade that's normal sized, and little tiny ones that are a bit brighter. I almost kind of wish this was just a thing in EDF, but with every bug. In Monster Hunter, the monsters come in varying sizes, and hunting a smaller than usual or larger than usual one is kind of interesting. These green ants felt the same way. I quite like the visual variety. The green ones are so much faster than the other colors, which makes their arrival turn into a frightening stampede. I specifically remember playing Mission 8 co-op with my buddy, on hard mode even, a good 20 or so times since we refused to turn it down to normal. Well, he refused anyway. The opening half of the mission we had to play it carefully, but the moment those green ants spawned on the map, we knew we only had seconds before all hell broke loose. While not their official introduction, Dust Town, Mission 4, was a fun way to properly show off these guys. Their spawning points come from within a few big buildings, and their arrival toppled them as they spilled out. I think the idea is that they're basically like nematodes from SpongeBob. They can chomp through everything and spread like wildfire.
Dang, nematodes!
They also have a different attack, which is kind of like their usual grab, but you get flung instead of trapped in their mouths. This, to me, makes them infinitely better than the silver and gold variations of the ants and spiders, as those don't really do anything new, they're just a bit stronger in some way. I've mentioned how much I dislike the dragon enemies, and the first mission pack is just chock full of them. The finale with the mothership was so much less enjoyable thanks to it spitting out dragons instead of drones. This is also likely why I can't appreciate their new attack pattern as much as other people, which is them flying single file in set formations. The theme for this DLC was mutants, which is why the golden and green ants, plus the silver spiders, are present in nearly every mission. I've mentioned before that a few mutant varieties get thrown in on harder difficulties for a few base missions, and I really like that idea. Maybe it was simply seeing them so much that made me apathetic towards them. When it's the gimmick of an entire batch of DLC, it starts to wear a bit thin. However, I'll admit this is basically a catch-22. Either the mutants get supposedly overused, or they don't use enough of them, and I call it filler. There were missions without any mutant varieties after all, but those felt the most like filler to me. The mission with Hectors and flight vehicles in a valley felt like something I'd expect in the main game, and was fine, but the second mission is simply a handful of Hectors walking down the street. In my co-op session, my guy equipped the non-reloadable Ravager weapons and finished the mission himself within 30 seconds. I feel like this has to be a me thing. Maybe I simply don't like DLC missions for EDF games for the reasons I said earlier. I don't know, hopefully someone out there got something out of this batch of DLC content. The second DLC's theme is simply, Arg, it's hard. Extreme levels. Every enemy is lined up for a battle. Survive the gauntlet. Whoa! Yeah, I don't have many nice things to say here either. Mission 1 starts off bad right out of the gate, boasting 3 dropships, but the gimmick here is that they don't stop moving. How much fun to chase down these guys and hopefully be in the right spot when they open their hatch. Most of this DLC is similar to the one before, but a few more levels stuck out. Beast Mobilization, Mission 9, is the epitome of what I was talking about earlier. Slap a bunch of gigantic boss enemies in one place, and call it a day. Bombs Away, Mission 11, is basically a complete waste of time on anything less than hard difficulty. Literally just stand there for the whole thing until you have a couple hectares left near the end. On Hardest and Inferno, it obviously was very different, but everything on Hardest and Inferno is brutal, so it's not really worth commenting on. Bloody River, Mission 14, is definitely very, very hard, but it's just not very interesting. I get it, all of these are red enemy types and they're placed in a river, Bloody River, but the placement of these advanced enemies is just in a big clump. The newly added red flight vehicles are here as well, which were introduced earlier in this DLC, and I hate them so much. So often it felt like I couldn't move at all. Their laser fire is just insane. Another difficult standout was Traps from Behind, Mission 16, which featured a ton of spiders, Retari, and D-Roys on a beach. This one was probably my favorite, and it mostly comes down to what they managed to do with what they decided to include. Again, this is the same beach as seen in a few other missions, but this feels wildly distinct. You begin at the shoreline, and the mainland has been consumed by spiders. There's a few spawners of regular silver ones, and many in-place purple Retari, a new mutant type also introduced in this DLC. This isn't the first time it's happened in this batch of content, as it occurred with the Argos as well, but the draw distance / fog effect gave the D-Roy approach a real sense of dread. An ominous visual for sure, one that would leave me questioning whether to make contact first, or wait for their arrival. 4 Queen Bees, 3 Argos, 7 Urginuses. It might be hard, but you have to admit this content was likely very simple to make. One mission before the Urginus rampage was also one I kind of enjoyed. Cross the Line, Mission 18. It took me 20 minutes, but I quite liked the Retari Hector DeRoy combination in this environment. It's a level I could easily envision being in the base game. I had to take out everything in front first, then flank the remaining batch, closing in cautiously from the side. The final mission in this DLC gets points for trying something at least a little different. It's equivalent to the final battle with the Earth Eaters and the Brain from the main game, but they're way closer to the ground. It's kind of interesting, at least visually, but I was pretty exhausted of this DLC at this point, so having to redo it because I didn't realize they started throwing in red flight vehicles just felt terrible. In fact, even though nothing else in the level really necessitates long-range weapons, given that they're so close, I equipped the Grom SS in place of a sniper. Bad move, since after you get rid of the low ceiling for the second time, the Brain is as far away as it was in the base game, and to reach it with my Grom, I had to do this over and over and over. Something that came into focus pretty clearly for me while doing this mission twice was how lackluster the audio is for all of this DLC. It feels like they mostly clipped dialogue from the base game and spliced them into these non-canon missions as needed.
We have a new giant to deal with.
How large?
It is heading to this area.
How large?
There are a few lines specific to the golden and silver giant insects and other such new oddities, so they had to have gotten the intercom lady and war general back in the booth, if only for an hour or two.
Silver giant insects are coming out of the underground tunnel.
Overall, though, the radio NPCs are always very short with their directions, go long stretches without saying a thing before repeating a generic line again, and they often don't react the way you'd expect they would. Well, I guess that last complaint is really all up to interpretation, but for me, because I don't know where these missions are supposed to land in the EDF timeline, it comes off as odd how little or drastically they respond to certain enemies. Are we supposed to be surprised to see a giant insect nest, or...
New giant insect hive has been confirmed. It's as big as a building.
Make no mistake, that's the giant insect nest.
There's a giant insect nest! So that is the giant insect nest. There's a whole mess of things going on inside.
Giant insects are appearing from the nest.
Giant insects are coming out.
Giant insects are coming out of the nest.
Oh. The Ravager scientist was also missing in action, which is a shame, since with all of these mutations and slight alterations, it would have been interesting to hear him gush about his theories on why some are silver and others gold and whatnot. I mean, they did add this line in.
The Ravagers have unleashed their ultimate creation on the Earth.
But it doesn't feel very specific, meaning they likely lifted it from the main campaign. I overall feel like I paid for 2 packs of non-canonical, gimmicky spin-off missions, which kind of sucks. I can definitely see why people would enjoy all of this, since it is more EDF, it's obviously harder, and some enemy combinations are absurd to a comical level, which is likely the point. I'm not upset that these have a positive rating on Steam or anything, I'm happy others enjoyed this, I just don't necessarily want more missions for the sake of more missions, and that can be said for difficulty as well. 96 levels in the online portion of the base game is already a very large number, so 50 more that mostly felt like filler content didn't satisfy me much. At the very least, it seems that some of the music that play in these levels were made specifically for this DLC, so a couple more Earth Defense Force songs certainly doesn't hurt. There's one more thing to touch on, and that's the actual spin-off game, 4.1 Wing Diver the Shooter. This could have been its own video, but I figure since it's so short, and it has 4.1 in the title, it makes sense to fit it into here instead. I also don't have a whole lot of experience with shoot-'em-up games, a genre which this game is definitely a part of. I can't pretend to have any real meaningful insight in the mechanics at play here, but I'll at least go over the game. There's a total of 6 missions with a beginning, middle, and end section. You play as a wing diver, utilizing some of the same weapons you'd find in 4.1 itself, and the item drops work in a similar fashion. Collect armor boxes to increase your max health, and weapon crates to potentially unlock a new weapon. There's a few significant differences though, in that if you fail, you do keep some amount of the armor you collected, but you don't keep any of the weapon crates. Because the game allows you to retry from one of the 3 sections at max health, you might find yourself acquiring, essentially, no new weapons, which is honestly pretty annoying. The final section of the level is always a boss fight, which almost never drops a weapon crate, so if you died and retried on the final boss, once the mission is officially completed, you only walk away with what you collected that last life, which is basically nothing. I may be generalizing a bit here, but I'd imagine the vast majority of video game players are far worse at traditional shoot-'em-ups than they are at third-person shooters, especially ones like Earth Defense Force. The reason is twofold, but both could actually feed into each other. First off, shoot-'em-ups just flat-out require faster reaction times, there's no getting around it. Playing Uncharted asks a lot less of the player than Ikaruga, not in quantity of mechanics, but in mastery of them. The genre itself is also far less popular, thus, in turn, it's less prominent. The majority of players can easily engage in gaming discourse and reference the industry as a whole while ignoring, whether purposefully or not, shoot-'em-ups entirely. This is 100% a niche style of game, and the type of gameplay on offer doesn't regularly show up in anything outside of this niche. The closest thing is whatever Kamiya is working on, since he includes a level like that in almost all of his games. This being the case, your average player simply hasn't had an opportunity to get any experience or practice anywhere else. The skills necessary to be good at these games simply haven't had a chance to subconsciously improve over time. Skill transfer is a very real thing, so if you played Gears of War, Uncharted, and Vanquish, I bet you'll do okay with Earth Defense Force. If you've played Halo, Counter-Strike, and Bioshock, I'd bet you'd do just fine with Call of Duty. Besides Undertale, I just don't see other opportunities for casual players to develop the skills necessary to read and avoid bullet hell patterns. Perhaps this was the point of it all, asking EDF fans to partake in playing a level over and over just to hopefully feel the rush of acquiring better weapons, something they've likely assumed was present in the game by the looks of it, meaning that they are getting that chance to hone their shoot-'em-up skills. To me, though, that just feels like a cop-out, a way to stretch these levels as far as possible. It is on sale pretty often, but its base price is $20. That seems a little absurd to me, given the level of content on offer here. If there were maybe 3 times as many missions, but you acquired the weapon pickups the same way as the armor, with retries not vanishing them altogether, I think this would have come across a lot better. They seem to be presenting all of this as if it has the EDF grinding loop, where you play easier missions to gain more armor and weapons, then slowly advance the difficulty. I just don't see the fun in playing these missions more than I have to, and specifically trying not to die at all, given how plainly easy it is to get hit if you aren't used to these games, turned me off considerably. If you complete the final level on hard mode, you do unlock Hardest and Inferno apparently, which are more varied in their bullet hell patterns, but I didn't even bother finishing all 6 on normal, so there was no way I was going to get good enough to see all that. Not my cup of tea by any means. The visuals are sometimes nice, specifically the final mothership level, and it was also interesting that they went into a bug nest, since we only ever saw the outside of it in 4.1. The best part of this game, believe it or not, was seeing the wing diver use the rapier as she flies over the bugs. When I saw this a few months ago, that was the first time I even considered that rapiers could be a good weapon, and sure enough, they're some of the best in the game. I feel like that might invalidate me as an EDF player, since I was stupid and incurious enough not to see how destructive they were on my own, so I'll move on. The way the wing diver fuel mechanics work in this game is, funnily enough, quite the opposite of how it works in the main game. In EDF 4.1, waiting for your fuel to come back normally is a comparatively slower process than going into emergency mode. Well, if you empty your energy in Wing Diver the Shooter, you're kinda fucked, actually. You can barely move, and it takes a lot longer to recharge than if you were to let go now and then. It makes sense as a punishment, I suppose, but I just thought it was funny how much it clashed with the main game mechanics. We kind of deviated from the main game of 4.1 for quite a while, but I think it's finally time to wrap this video up. Earth Defense Force 4.1 is a great game, and a fantastic sequel to 2017. Like I said in that 2017 video, buying and playing 4.1 on a whim was the reason I started to take this series seriously. That might sound oxymoronic, since the campy nature of EDF and wacky gameplay is something not to be taken seriously, but I think you know what I mean. As much as others, even fans of the series, call it simplistic dumb fun, I think there's more to Earth Defense Force than that, and at its best, which 4.1 and 5 start to show, the games can be crafted in a way that asks us to be tactical and smart with our decisions in combat. There's more weapons than ever before to unlock and test for yourselves, and the discovery stage of trying them out in different circumstances is very enjoyable. Before making this video, I would easily say that 5 is better than 4.1, but after spending an extra 150 hours with it, trying out all the classes properly and experimenting with the online lobbies, I've grown to love it much more than I had previously. If EDF 5 was a 9 out of 10, 4.1 was an 8, but now, I think I'd bump it up to like an 8.5. I'm very curious if the same eventually happens with the 5th game, if it becomes better after I become obsessed with it for a couple of weeks. I don't know when that'll be, since I'd rather not burn myself out of EDF any more than I had to for making this video. Thanks for watching, you made it to the end. Holy shit, you're a legend. I simply can't believe how long this is. I was figuring it would be a 30 to 40 minute video and I just kept writing. Hopefully the next one is a return to normalcy. I wouldn't mind a 30-minute video on something smaller to cleanse my palate of these long boys. Thanks again to my patrons, some of which should be scrolling by right now. Subscribe to the channel if you would so kindly, and you know what? Hit the bell too, especially if you want to be made aware of when the next EDF video drops. Alright, that's it for me. I hope you continue to have passion and camaraderie, much like Alpha Team and their valiant infantry.
Yeah, my missiles